Your book spends about 4 or 5 pages talking about the history of sports marketing, and and I think it's all really good stuff, and you ought to read it. I thought I would approach this in a slightly different way to try to put a little bit of structure on the evolution of sports marketing. I'm going to talk about sports marketing in terms of 4 different eras. And I'm going to start, of course, with the beginning era, that is the 1900s to 1950 era. The big sports in that era were things like horse racing, boxing, the Olympics. Baseball was very big then. A little bit of tennis and a little bit of golf. But college sports were big during that particular time. Um, but it was sort of interesting because at that point, the media was either you went to an event in person, or you read the sports pages after the fact, or you listened to the radio for a real-time broadcast. Now, if you think watching golf or maybe even tennis on TV is not as exciting as it could be, think about listening to golf broadcasts on the radio, or even a horse race on the radio compared to one on television. In this era, the NFL was in its infancy. There was very little professional football. I do have here in the background Red Grange, who was a famous football player for the University of Illinois, and the person who helped the NFL get started. The NFL was mostly a Midwestern organization, and since he was from the University of Illinois, he was one of the people who helped establish the Professional Football League. Individual sports were very popular, as were sporting events like the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown, prize fights. The World Series was very popular because there were 7 games. Of course, sports writers were the main source of information prior to and after the game, and announcers, of course, on radio during the game. The high-profile teams were the New York Yankees, along with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. Notre Dame football with the coach Knute Rockne. Those were sort of the high-profile teams during that era. And once again, professional football wasn't very big. Professional basketball wasn't very big, and even college basketball wasn't very big. The high-profile sports were college football and professional baseball. But it was in this era when the players started to reach celebrity status. Probably the most famous of all baseball players, of course, is Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth helped elevate the New York Yankees in baseball to a fever pitch status whenever the Yankees played in the World Series. The next era was 1950 to 1990, and I would call this the golden era in sports. Of course, I was born during this time, and so I grew up in this particular era. This is when television started to broadcast sports. Suddenly, things like golf became more exciting because you could actually see the golf. And of course, golf's golden boy at the time was a person by the name of Arnold Palmer, who, and you can see he's in the background here on this slide. Arnold Palmer was the poster child for professional golf. During this era, there was something called the Wide World of Sports. It would come on every Saturday, and it would typically be a replay of some sporting event that took place in the last week or month or so. They always had an interesting introduction, and their tagline was "The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat." In terms of baseball, there was one game broadcast on television every week, and that was a Saturday baseball game. and that was called baseball's Game of the Week. And it was always announced by Dizzy Dean and Pee Wee Reese. Dizzy Dean had been a famous pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, and Pee Wee Reese had been a shortstop, a very famous shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers. This is also the era when Monday Night Football got started. Now, you probably are familiar with Monday Night Football today, but it was a great big deal when it started in the late 70s. And it had on there Don Meredith, a famous quarterback from the Dallas Cowboys, Frank Gifford, one of the most famous football players in the New York area. He played for the New York Football Giants. And, of course, Howard Cosell. And they made Monday Night Football, and it really propelled the NFL into viewer stardom. Every Monday night, everybody would stop whatever they were doing and watch Monday Night Football. This was also an era where NASCAR became very popular. And NASCAR was popular because it was great television. Without television, NASCAR would obviously not have been anywhere near as successful. But with television, it became one of the national sports, of course, and it is very popular in certain regions of the country. Here in Las Vegas, we have 2 giant NASCAR events a year. The Kentucky Derby became a real TV event, which included a 3-hour broadcast for a 3-minute race. And of course, the famous line for the Kentucky Derby is, "And down the stretch they come." The World Series was moved from being a day games to prime time. So you would watch the World Series at night, and this was a new thing in the TV era. The Super Bowl became the single biggest sporting event of the year. I have a good friend named Jimmy who attended the very first Super Bowl. It was held in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Coliseum, and it was between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Green Bay Packers. And he told me, I believe, that it cost $200 to fly to Las Vegas the night before the game, stay in Las Vegas, fly to Los Angeles the morning of the game, go to the game by bus, come back to the airport, and then fly back to Kansas City. This year, of course, he went to the Super Bowl again, and it was also a good experience for him. The difference, of course, was that the Kansas City Chiefs won this time. Of course, it was about a $3,000 trip this time instead of a $225 trip. It was during this era that the Dallas Football Cowboys became America's team. Sports that translated well to television were suddenly the most popular. Things like golf and tennis and Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, college football, basketball, boxing, auto racing, and even horse racing all translated wonderfully to television, and as a result, they became very popular. No longer did you have to rely on newspaper accounts after the fact or to radio announcers in real time. You could actually see the games without actually being there. The next era is one that I call the Proliferation Era. This would be 1991 to 2010. We could also call this the ESPN era. While ESPN was actually started in 1979, it really took hold in the early 1990s. Up until that point in time, they were broadcasting lots of replays of previous events. They had a lot of Australian rules football on ESPN. They had a bunch of very oddball things on their channels just to fill the dead airspace. When ESPN became popular, it marked the end of the Wide World of Sports weekly replay era, because ESPN suddenly was able to broadcast sporting events live. And of course, this was the era when sports became a 24-hour-a-day TV extravaganza. The new networks included Major League Baseball, the NBA channel, the NFL channel, the golf channel, the tennis channel, ESPN 1, ESPN 2, ESPN 3, ESPN News, ESPN University, CBS Sports, NBC Sports. Of course, daily horse racing is televised. And of course, this was the era when we had the very first podcasts and streaming sporting events on the internet. This was also an era when pay-per-view boxing really expanded. And then we have the most recent era, and this is an era that many of you are at least familiar with. This is the last 10 years or so. And so during this era, like other entertainment options, sports suddenly became a multi-screen delivery system, from televisions to computers to tablets and to smartphones, etc., etc. The big change here has been the impact of the internet on the delivery of sports. You can now access sports information from any team or individual in a variety of ways. Many of you follow a particular athlete or a particular team on Twitter, or maybe you follow them on their fan page, or maybe you follow them on a number of sports news websites. So one of the fun things about this era is that part of it is a social media driven era with user generated content. And this is user generated content by fans, but also by athletes. And of course, you know that athletes often get themselves into trouble when they start using social media as a way to communicate to their fans. Also, this is an era where college sports became available to anyone who wanted to see them. With league channels like the Big Ten channel, the Pac-12 channel, and the SEC channel, and team channels like the Texas Longhorn channel, and the LSU channel, and the Alabama channel. And there's a sort of a funny story that goes along with this. Think about this for just a second. You can watch the University of Texas Longhorns 24 hours a day. But most of the UNLV basketball games are not televised. And you might wonder why that is. I know that I wonder why that is, although I have a fairly good explanation. By the way, our basketball team's record is much better than the University of Texas's ever was or is. And we were national champions in 1990. And yes, I was there, or here, in 1990. So the real question is, what's next? And that is the $24 question for all of us in sports marketing.